The Institute for Economic Justice, as well as hashtag Pay the Grants, are at loggerheads with government over the Social Relief of Distress grant. They're challenging regulations that they say are unlawfully and unconstitutionally excluding millions of people living in poverty. To discuss this further, we're joined by Neil Coleman. He is a senior policy specialist with the Institute for Economic Justice. Mr. Coleman, thank you very much for your time here on South Africa Tonight this evening. So you say the regulations that govern the 350 Rand Social Relief of Distress grants value, the eligibility criteria and the application procedures, as well as the manner in which the grant has been implemented, have excluded millions of people, violating their right to social assistance and food, which is guaranteed, of course, under Section 27 of the Constitution. How many people receive the grant now compared to March last year?
Thanks. Good evening. In March 2022, 10.9 million people received the grant. About 8.5 million people have been approved for the grant currently, but only about 7.1 million people have received it. There are also issues about people being approved, not actually receiving the grant. But the bottom line is that based on government's research and our own research, we estimate that about 16 million people should be getting the grant, but that a whole host of exclusionary provisions have been put in place deliberately, actually, at the instance of National Treasury, who have refused to make the resources available for the grant and have limited the numbers who can receive the grant to 8.5 million. And to effect this exclusion, basically DSD has been forced to introduce a whole series of restrictions which make it very difficult for people to access the grant, including the issues that you spoke about, including very broad definition of income. So if you get any form of income from a family relative or child support or a whole host of other forms of donation or assistance, then you get excluded from the grant if you have more than 624 Rand in your bank account. So we believe this is unconstitutional and unlawful, and our lawyers have advised us that various sections of the regulations need to be struck down or amended. So that's the basis under which we are challenging the court action, because if government puts a policy in place, it has to fund and enable that policy rather than to self-sabotage, which is currently what has been happening.
So I think many South Africans are in a similar position to myself, where, you know, we heard the news that this grant was going to be extended, the amount was going to stay the same, and that government had allocated a certain amount of money in order to be able to pay out the grant as promised. I can't remember that exact number. I think we're bombarded by so much information every day.
Yeah, it's 36 billion.
36
for
billion
2023.
Are you essentially now saying that they are no longer willing to distribute that 36 billion, or is that figure changed?
No, the 36 billion puts a cap on the grant. So it puts a cap on a maximum of 8.5 million people a month receiving the grant. So what that does is it excludes the other about 8 million people who should be beneficiaries, according to government's own statistics, from receiving the grant. Now, I think we must just put this in perspective. You know, people hear 36 billion and they say, that sounds a huge amount, but that is less than 2% of our national budget, less than 2%, which is benefiting, according to research by UNU wider, is benefiting up to 31 million of the population. In other words, half of the population are directly or indirectly benefiting from the grant, the poorest half of the population. So in a situation where 1 in 5 households is now, according to a study by Wits University this year, regularly sending out a member of the household to beg for food, we have a crisis of hunger and poverty in our society, and therefore, a refusal to go above 2% of the budget to serve the poorest 50% of the population is both cruel and immoral. And therefore, we believe those resources can easily be channeled. For example, in 2021 and 2022, according to Treasury's own projections, 250 billion rand extra revenue was achieved, 250 billion rand. Most of that was used to retire debt. Now, what is more important? Half of the population is facing literally, starvation and destitution, or the macroeconomic sort of ratios. I think, this is a conversation that South Africans need to have about what sort of society we want to be. Do we want to be a society in which half our population is literally, at the point of destitution and hunger? This is what this case is really fundamentally about.
Yeah, it is a very complex consideration to make, because at the same time as we have soaring unemployment and a diminishing tax base, government is under pressure to try and stimulate job creation. In order to do that, they need to stimulate economic growth. In order to do that, we can't keep incurring more and more debt. We have to try and level out some of that debt. I'm not fighting it in their case. I'm just stating sort of that's on the other side of this principle of we have to weigh up the two, and there's absolutely no doubt that there are millions of South Africans in dire need of this grant, and we have to find a better balance. Do you think government is even coming to the party to hear your argument?
I think they are. I think they are coming to the party. The problem is different wings of government are pulling in different directions. If you look at the president's newsletter in March this year on this very issue, he refers to research that has been done by about 4 institutions, which show even this tiny 350 Rand grant has had very beneficial impacts in terms of stimulating economic activity in communities, stimulating job seeking, stimulating the informal sector, etc. And this is completely in line with the research that the IEJ has done on the international experience, which shows that income transfers are not merely a welfare or charity intervention. They must form part of a developmental strategy. And so, if you're looking at questions like how do we stimulate economic activity and growth, this must be a very important element of that, because if you exclude half your population from economic activity, obviously that's going to lead to massive economic stagnation and depression. So we think this is a very important investment in development in our society, and all evidence points in that direction.
We have run out of time, but I do quickly want to ask you, what is the next step in moving the issue forward?
Well, this court action is a last resort on our part. We've made submissions, we've met with government departments, et cetera, et cetera. So this court action is now going forward. We think it's a very compelling and powerful case. At the same time, we are engaging with presidency, government departments to try and move forward pathways towards a permanent and much more dignified system of basic income. We think that this is something that is achievable, something that the president, we think, supports. Certainly the ruling party has taken resolutions on this. So I think we are cautiously optimistic, but these very cruel and immoral exclusionary provisions in the legislation have to be changed if we are to build a system of basic income which is in line with our constitution.
And of course, we do have to look at the disparity between the number of people who have been approved for grants and the number of people who have been paid out. That's very important. Thank you very much for your time this evening. That was Neil Coleman. He's a senior policy specialist with the Institute for Economic Justice in partnership with #PayTheGrants. They are taking government to court.